Pretend to be my wife, the desperate rancher declares to the seamstress across his engagement party, his voice shattering the crystalline silence as 100 pairs of eyes turn toward the black woman they dismissed as mere help. The world sees her as nothing, a shadow meant for mending clothes and scrubbing floors, destined for poverty and silence until death claims her ailing mother. But the wealthy cattleman drowning in his family's suffocating expectations glimpses something else: salvation from a loveless business marriage that will cage him forever. Their bargain promises mutual rescue, his money for her performance, her dignity for his freedom. Yet beneath their carefully constructed lie lurks a dangerous truth neither anticipated, genuine connection that threatens to destroy the very arrangement keeping them both alive. Can two people fake love without falling victim to it? Or will their desperate deception consume them both? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The August sun beat mercilessly down on the Wyoming territory as Etta Mae Washington clutched her sewing basket and approached the towering gates of Hollister Ranch. Dust swirled around her worn boots as she took in the sprawling estate before her. Cattle dotted the endless pastures while the main house rose like a monument to wealth and power. She had traveled 2 days from town expecting simple alterations work. The telegram had been brief but promising. Good pay for skilled seamstress. Immediate start required. The front porch gleamed with fresh white paint and ornate columns. Etta Mae climbed the steps and knocked on the heavy oak door. A stern-faced housekeeper answered, her eyes narrowing as they swept over the young black woman. Servant's entrance is around back. The door slammed shut. Etta Mae's cheeks burned with familiar shame, but she walked around the massive house without protest. Survival meant swallowing pride. Her mother, Sarah, lay dying in their one-room cabin, and the doctor's bills mounted daily. The kitchen entrance buzzed with activity. Servers rushed past carrying silver trays and crystal glasses. Through the open doorway, Etta Mae glimpsed an elaborate celebration in progress. Men in fine suits and women in silk gowns filled an enormous parlor decorated with white roses and golden ribbons. "You the seamstress?" A harried cook barely glanced up from her preparations. "Upstairs maid's dress needs hemming. Quick now. Can't have staff looking shabby tonight." Etta Mae followed a servant up the back stairs, her mind racing. This was no ordinary evening. The grandeur below suggested something momentous was happening, something that required perfection from every detail, including the help. In a cramped attic room, she found the torn dress. The fabric was fine, but the repair simple. Her skilled fingers worked quickly while sounds of celebration drifted up from below. Laughter, music, the clink of champagne glasses. "Hurry up," the maid whispered. "Master Thomas is announcing his engagement tonight. Biggest party this territory's ever seen." Etta Mae's hands stilled. An engagement party. She finished the hem and handed back the dress, but curiosity kept her lingering near the servant's stairs. Through the banister rails, she could see into the grand parlor where Wyoming's elite had gathered. At the center of it all stood a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-weathered hands. Even from a distance, Thomas Hollister commanded attention. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, his black suit expensive, but something in his posture spoke of a caged animal. He smiled and nodded at well-wishers, yet his eyes held no joy. Near the marble fireplace, an elegant blonde woman in emerald silk held court among a circle of admirers. Cordelia Ashworth, daughter of the railroad magnate. Her beauty was undeniable, her breeding obvious, her future secure. The perfect match for Wyoming's cattle king. "Thomas, dear boy," a silver-haired judge raised his glass. "When will you make the official announcement? We're all eager to toast your happiness." Etta Mae watched Thomas's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He lifted his own glass with practiced ease. "All in good time, Judge Morrison." The crowd pressed closer, anticipation electric in the air. This was the moment they'd all come to witness, the union of two powerful families, the merging of cattle and railroad fortunes. A business arrangement disguised as romance. Etta Mae should have retreated to the kitchen, should have collected her payment and departed for home. Instead, she found herself drawn down the servants' stairs, staying in the shadows but moving closer to the spectacle. Judge Morrison's voice boomed across the parlor. "Come now, don't keep us in suspense. Where is this mysterious bride-to-be?" Thomas's mother, a formidable woman in black velvet, glided to her son's side. Matilda Hollister's smile was sharp as a blade. "Cordelia, darling, come join us." The blonde beauty approached with graceful steps, her hand extended toward Thomas. The crowd fell silent, sensing the momentous announcement. Glasses raised in preparation for the toast. All eyes fixed on the couple at the center of the room. Etta May pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding. She had no business witnessing this private moment, this celebration of privilege and power. She was an intruder in a world that would never welcome her. Judge Morrison's eyes found her in the shadows. His expression shifted from anticipation to disgust. "What is that doing here?" Every head turned, every gaze fell upon Etta May like a physical weight. The celebration froze, as if time itself had stopped. Servants weren't supposed to be visible during such occasions, especially not servants who looked like her. "I beg your pardon?" Matilda Hollister's voice could have cut glass. The judge pointed a jeweled finger directly at Etta May. "That woman has no business among decent folk. This is a private gathering." Heat flooded Etta May's cheeks. Her mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. But her feet remained frozen to the polished floor. "Someone remove her immediately," Judge Morrison continued, his voice growing louder. "Such impudence cannot be tolerated." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others simply stared. Cordelia Ashworth watched with cold amusement, as if observing an interesting but distasteful specimen. Etta May finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "I was just leaving." "Not fast enough," the judge declared. The humiliation burned like acid in her throat. This was her life, her place, her destiny. To be dismissed, discarded, reminded constantly of her position in the world's order. Thomas Hollister had not spoken, had not moved. But something in his expression was changing as he watched the scene unfold. Thomas Hollister watched the judge's cruel words slice through the woman like a whip. Something snapped inside him. The months of forced smiles, orchestrated courtship, and business negotiations disguised as romance suddenly crystallized into pure rebellion. He strode across the parlor with decisive steps. Every eye followed his movement. Cordelia's hand remained extended, confusion replacing her confident smile. The crowd held its collective breath. Thomas stopped directly in front of Etta May. Her dark eyes met his, wide with shock and lingering humiliation. Up close, he could see the intelligence flickering behind her fear. Something about her bearing suggested depths the room had completely missed. "Judge Morrison," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent parlor. "You're absolutely right. She has no business among you." Etta May's shoulders sagged, the final blow delivered by the very man she'd watched from afar. Her feet shifted toward the servants' stairs, ready to flee this nightmare. Thomas reached for her hand. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and surprisingly calloused for a wealthy rancher. She froze at the unexpected contact. "This woman is my wife." The words hit the gathering like a thunderclap. Cordelia's face went white. Judge Morrison's glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Matilda Hollister swayed as if she might faint. "Impossible," someone whispered. Thomas lifted their joined hands higher, his grip steady and sure. "We married in secret 3 weeks ago. I kept it private because I knew some of you wouldn't understand." Etta May stared at him in complete shock. This was madness, social suicide, career destruction. Yet something in his eyes urged her to trust him, to follow his desperate lead. The moment stretched like a bowstring. She could expose his lie with a single word, could denounce him and flee back to her world of shadows and servitude. Instead, some deeper instinct took control. Etta May straightened her spine. Her chin lifted with newfound dignity. When she spoke, Her voice carried an unexpected refinement that made several guests step closer in surprise. "I apologize for the deception, but Thomas insisted on privacy until tonight." Her diction was perfect, her grammar flawless. "We wanted our love to speak for itself before facing society's judgment." A collective gasp rippled through the room. This was not the voice of a simple seamstress, not the speech pattern of someone born to servitude. The transformation was so complete that several people rubbed their eyes as if questioning their vision. Judge Morrison sputtered. "This is preposterous. She's clearly a servant. I saw her skulking about like hired help." "She was checking on her alterations work," Thomas replied smoothly. "My wife has many talents. Sewing is simply one of them." Etta May felt the lie building momentum. Some primal survival instinct kicked in, drawing on years of careful observation and secret education. She had watched wealthy women from afar, studied their mannerisms, absorbed their speech patterns. Now those observations became armor. "The work was a wedding gift for the staff," she added gracefully. "I believe in helping others when possible." Her posture had completely transformed. Gone was the hunched, defensive stance of someone expecting cruelty. In its place stood a woman who belonged in elegant parlors and silk gowns. The change was so dramatic that several guests began whispering among themselves. Cordelia finally found her voice, though it emerged as a strangled whisper. "Thomas, what about our engagement?" "There was never an engagement," he replied firmly. "Only an assumption. I've been trying to find the right moment to explain, but my mother kept pushing forward with tonight's celebration." Matilda Hollister's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous pale. "Thomas Edward Hollister, what have you done?" "What I should have done months ago. I married for love." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Love was supposed to be secondary to business alliances, family connections, social positioning. It certainly wasn't supposed to cross racial lines in 1875 Wyoming territory. Etta May squeezed Thomas's hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. She had to keep this performance alive until they could escape. Her mother's life depended on whatever payment she might salvage from this disaster. "Perhaps we should have been braver sooner," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of regret mixed with defiance. "But surely you can understand our caution given the circumstances." Her careful word choice and measured tone continued to bewilder the guests. This woman spoke like she'd received formal education, like she'd read books and studied grammar. Nothing about her fit their preconceptions. Judge Morrison's face grew purple with rage. "This is a scandal, an absolute scandal. The authorities should be notified." "About what?" Thomas challenged. "A legal marriage between consenting adults? You cannot seriously expect us to accept this charade. I expect you to respect my wife or leave my home." The ultimatum crackled with authority. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the power behind Thomas's words. He owned half the territory's grazing land and employed dozens of their relatives. Crossing him carried serious consequences. Cordelia's father stepped forward, his railroad money giving him confidence others lacked. "This marriage cannot stand. Our families have agreements, contracts." "No contracts were signed regarding marriage," Thomas replied coldly. "Only business arrangements that remain separate from my personal life." Etta May watched the power dynamics shift around them. These people wielded influence through money and social position. But they also depended on Thomas's goodwill. Their calculation showed on their faces as they weighed outrage against practical necessity. The performance had to end soon. Her heart hammered against her ribs while sweat gathered between her shoulder blades. One wrong word could destroy everything. Thomas seemed to sense her tension. He turned toward the stunned crowd with finality. "The celebration is over." Dawn light filtered through the enormous windows of Thomas Hollister's study as Etta May sat rigidly in a leather chair that probably cost more than her annual income. The previous night felt like a fever dream. The shocked faces of Wyoming's elite, the whispered scandals, the way Thomas had guided her through the chaos with steady determination. Now, in the harsh light of morning, reality pressed down like a weight. She had participated in a public deception that could destroy them both. Thomas paced behind his mahogany desk, running his hands through dark hair that no longer held its perfect styling. His formal jacket hung over a chair back, leaving him in shirt sleeves that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. Even disheveled, he commanded the room with an authority that came from years of making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally, stopping near the window that overlooked his vast holdings. Etta May folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "An explanation would be helpful, yes." Her voice remained steady despite the churning in her stomach. The refined speech patterns from the night before came naturally now, as if the performance had unlocked something she'd kept carefully hidden. Thomas turned to face her fully. "My mother has been orchestrating business marriages for 2 years. The Ashworth Alliance would merge cattle and railroad interests, making both families wealthier than kings." "And you object to wealth?" "I object to being sold like livestock." His jaw tightened. "Cordelia is beautiful, well-bred, and utterly indifferent to anything beyond social advancement. Our marriage would have been a business transaction with occasional pleasantries over breakfast." Etta May studied his expression, searching for deception or manipulation. Instead, she saw genuine frustration mixed with something that looked like desperation. "So, you used me to escape your golden cage?" "Yes." The admission came without apology or excuse. "I saw Judge Morrison humiliating you, and something snapped. The lie came out before I could stop it." The honesty surprised her. She had expected elaborate justifications or promises that meant nothing. Instead, he offered simple truth. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas moved to his desk and withdrew a leather folder. "Now I make you a proposition that benefits us both." He spread papers across the polished surface, revealing documents written in careful legal language. Etta May rose and approached, her eyes scanning the text with practiced ease. The words blurred together at first, then crystallized into an offer so extraordinary she had to read it twice. "A contract marriage," Thomas explained, 1 year in duration. "You would live here as my wife, attend social functions, maintain the facade we created last night." Etta May's finger traced down the list of terms. $500 upon completion, a fully equipped dress shop in town with living quarters above, monthly allowance for expenses, medical care for her mother. The numbers made her dizzy. "The arrangement includes one non-negotiable condition," Thomas continued. "No romantic feelings. This is purely business. We maintain separate bedrooms, separate lives. In public, we play the devoted couple. In private, we remain strangers." The words should have stung, but Etta May felt only relief. Romance between them was impossible anyway. He was risking enough by associating with her publicly. Expecting genuine affection would be pure fantasy. "Why would you trust me with such a deception? I could expose everything." "You could," he agreed. "But you won't." His certainty rankled. "You seem very confident in your assessment of my character. I watched you last night. You could have revealed the lie immediately and saved yourself embarrassment. Instead, you protected a stranger's desperate gamble. That tells me everything I need to know." Etta May returned her attention to the contract, her mind racing through possibilities and dangers. The money would save her mother's life and provide security beyond her wildest dreams. But the risks were enormous. Discovery would mean social destruction for both of them. Legal consequences could include imprisonment. "What about your mother? Your business associates? They'll never accept this arrangement." "My mother will adjust or face the consequences. My business associates care more about profits than my personal life. As for society, they'll either adapt or find themselves excluded from my dealings." The casual dismissal of such powerful opposition spoke to resources Etta May could barely comprehend. Thomas Hollister didn't just own land and cattle. He owned influence that extended far beyond Wyoming territory. "There's something else you should know," she said carefully. "I'm not what I appeared to be last night." Thomas raised an eyebrow. Meaning? The speech, the mannerisms, the way I handled myself. That wasn't pure performance. I received education that most people like me never get. She told him about Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, the kind-hearted wife of her former master who had secretly taught reading, writing, mathematics, and etiquette to several enslaved children. About the hidden books and whispered lessons that continued even after freedom came. About the decision to hide her education to avoid suspicion and resentment. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each revelation. When she finished, he nodded slowly. That makes you perfect for this arrangement. You already know how to move in their world when necessary. And when this year ends, you disappear with enough money to start fresh anywhere you choose. I'll claim the marriage didn't work due to outside pressures. We part ways and never see each other again. The finality in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, something twisted uncomfortably in Etta May's chest. She pushed the feeling aside and focused on practical matters. I need guarantees about my mother's care. And legal protection if this arrangement is discovered. Already included in Section 4. She read the relevant passages, impressed by the thoroughness. Someone had anticipated every possible complication and prepared accordingly. When would this begin? Today. The longer we wait, the more suspicious our story becomes. Etta May stared at the contract that would transform her life completely. One signature would lift her family from poverty and desperation. It would also thrust her into a world where every moment required careful performance, where one mistake could destroy everything. The pen felt impossibly heavy in her hand as she signed her name in careful script. Thomas signed below her signature, then extended his hand for a formal shake. Welcome to Hollister Ranch, Mrs. Hollister. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Etta May stood in the main house's grand foyer, adjusting a vase of wildflowers. The servants had stopped staring at her with open suspicion, though whispered conversations still ceased when she entered rooms. Progress came in small victories. Her mother, Sarah, had gained weight since moving into the comfortable cottage Thomas provided. Color had returned to cheeks that had been gray with sickness for months. The finest doctor in the territory visited twice weekly, bringing medicines that actually worked instead of false hope. Thomas emerged from his study carrying ledgers thick with cattle records. Dark circles shadowed his eyes from late nights managing ranch business that had grown complicated since their public marriage. Several business associates had withdrawn their support, though others had stepped forward with unexpected offers. The Patterson family wants to discuss a partnership, he said without preamble. They're hosting dinner Thursday evening. We need to attend together. Etta May nodded, already calculating the performance required. The Pattersons owned vast wheat farms and represented new money trying to establish social respectability. They might prove more accepting than old families with entrenched prejudices. I'll prepare accordingly. Thomas paused near the staircase, his gaze lingering on her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. These moments of unexpected attention had become more frequent lately. Brief interludes where the careful distance between them seemed to waver. The blue dress would be appropriate, the one from your new wardrobe. He had insisted on purchasing extensive clothing suitable for a rancher's wife. Silks and satins that transformed her appearance completely. When properly dressed and styled, she could pass inspection in any parlor from Denver to San Francisco. Of course, the conversation should have ended there. Instead, Thomas remained on the bottom step, his hand resting on the carved banister. The afternoon light streaming through tall windows highlighted the strong line of his jaw and the careful control he maintained over every expression. Etta May. Her name came softly, almost hesitantly. Are you content with this arrangement? The question caught her off guard. Contentment seemed an inadequate word for the complex mixture of gratitude, anxiety, and something else she refused to examine too closely. My mother is alive and healthy. I have security I never dreamed possible. Yes, I'm content. Thomas studied her face as if searching for hidden meanings. Good. That's good. He climbed the stairs with measured steps, leaving behind the faint scent of leather and sage that seemed to follow him everywhere. Etta May watched until he disappeared around the corner, then pressed her palm against her chest where her heart had begun beating too quickly. The forbidden thoughts came more frequently now. Observations about the way his hands moved when he explained ranch business. The rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. The protective instinct that had driven him to defend a stranger at his own engagement party. She pushed such dangerous nonsense aside and focused on practical matters. Thursday's dinner required careful preparation. The right dress, appropriate jewelry, flawless mannerisms that would reflect well on Thomas's choice of bride. Their public appearances had become smoother with practice. She learned to take his arm with natural ease, to laugh at his carefully chosen comments, to display the affection expected between newlyweds. The performance felt less forced each time. Sheriff Lucas Bywater appeared in the doorway without knocking, a habit that annoyed the household staff but seemed to amuse Thomas. The lawman's weathered face showed skepticism that hadn't diminished, despite weeks of observation. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hollister." The title came with subtle emphasis that suggested continued doubt about its legitimacy. "Sheriff Bywater, how may I help you?" "Looking for your husband. Got some questions about cattle rustling reports." Etta May gestured toward the study. "He's reviewing ledgers. Please make yourself comfortable." Bywater's pale eyes studied her with uncomfortable intensity. Something about his scrutiny felt personal rather than professional. She had noticed his particular attention during previous visits, as if he were searching for specific information. "Mighty convenient marriage," he said conversationally. Timing worked out perfectly for everyone involved. The comment carried implications that made her stomach tighten. "I'm not sure what you mean, Sheriff." Young woman appears from nowhere just when a wealthy rancher needs to escape family expectations. Makes a person wonder about motivations. Heat crawled up Etta May's neck, but she maintained steady eye contact. "Are you suggesting something improper about our marriage?" "Just observing coincidences. Amazing how many of those seem to follow certain people around." Thomas appeared in the study doorway before she could respond. His expression hardened when he saw the sheriff's challenging posture and Etta May's tense shoulders. "Sheriff, what brings you here?" "Cattle rustling. Lost about 30 head from your northern pasture sometime this week." Business discussion replaced personal interrogation as Thomas led the lawman into his study. But Etta May noticed Bywater's backward glance, his pale eyes holding questions that wouldn't be easily dismissed. Evening brought the day's most comfortable ritual. Dinner conversation that had evolved from stilted politeness into something approaching genuine companionship. Thomas proved surprisingly well-read despite his rough profession. He could discuss literature, philosophy, even poetry when the mood struck him. "Patterson mentioned bringing his cousin from Boston," Thomas said over dessert. "University graduate with strong opinions about Western development. Should I prepare for condescension or curiosity?" "Both, probably. Eastern folks tend to view Wyoming as barely civilized." Etta May smiled at the irony. "They might be surprised by what they find." "They might indeed." Their eyes met across the polished table, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. Recognition, perhaps. Appreciation for qualities that ran deeper than surface appearances. The moment stretched until Thomas cleared his throat and returned his attention to his coffee. But the warmth remained, a dangerous ember that threatened to ignite feelings neither of them could afford. Later that night, Etta May stood at her bedroom window watching stars emerge over the vast ranch lands. 6 more months remained on their contract. 6 months of careful performance, controlled distance, and growing attraction that violated every term of their agreement. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and wondered if she was strong enough to walk away when the time came. The October storm struck with Wyoming's typical fury, driving rain against the ranch house windows like thrown stones. Etta May paced the main parlor, listening to wind howl through the eaves, while Thomas remained overdue from checking the northern pastures. Ranch hands had returned hours ago, but her husband stayed out in conditions that could kill a man. Lightning illuminated the darkness as hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Etta May rushed to the front door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas stumbled inside, soaked to the skin, his left arm hanging at an awkward angle. "Cattle spooked during the lightning," he said through gritted teeth. "Horse threw me into a fence post." Blood seeped through his torn shirt where barbed wire had carved deep gashes across his shoulder. His face had gone pale beneath the tan, and his jaw worked against obvious pain. Etta May guided him toward the parlor sofa, without thinking about contract terms or emotional distance. "Sit down before you fall down." She fetched medical supplies from the kitchen, her hands surprisingly steady despite the crisis. Thomas had removed his shirt by the time she returned, revealing the full extent of his injuries. Angry red welts crisscrossed his shoulder and upper arm where wire had caught him during the fall. "This needs proper cleaning." She dampened a cloth with whiskey from his private stock. "It's going to hurt." "Can't hurt worse than it already does." Thomas's breath hissed between his teeth as she worked. The cuts were deep but clean, with no embedded debris to complicate healing. Her gentle touch contrasted sharply with his obvious suffering, and something shifted in the space between them. "Where did you learn medical care?" he asked, his voice strained. "Necessity. Doctors didn't come when people like us got hurt." She wrapped his shoulder with careful precision, her fingers brushing against skin that felt fever-warm despite the cold rain. Each touch sent unexpected awareness shooting through her body. The careful distance they maintained had evaporated under the intimacy forced by his injury. Thunder crashed overhead as she secured the bandages. Thomas caught her wrist gently, his calloused thumb tracing across her pulse point. The simple contact sent heat racing up her arm. "Thank you." Their faces were inches apart. His breath warmed her cheek as rain continued battering the windows. 6 months of suppressed attraction crystallized into a single moment of dangerous possibility. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. "You should rest," she whispered. "Should I?" His free hand rose to cup her cheek, fingers threading into hair that had escaped its careful pins. The touch was achingly gentle, completely at odds with his reputation as a hard man who bent Wyoming territory to his will. Etta May closed her eyes, leaning into the caress despite every rational thought screaming warnings. The contract's primary rule echoed in her mind even as her body betrayed every logical defense. No romantic feelings. Pure business arrangement. Professional distance at all times. "We can't do this," she said, though she made no move to pull away. "I know." Thomas's thumb brushed across her lower lip with reverent care. "But God help me, I want to." The confession hung between them like a bridge they both knew they shouldn't cross. 6 months of careful performance had built something real and dangerous, something that threatened the very foundation of their practical arrangement. "Thomas!" His name escaped as barely a breath. The front door burst open with violent force. Sheriff Bywater strode inside without invitation, rain dripping from his hat brim as his pale eyes took in the intimate scene before him. Thomas dropped his hand immediately, but the damage was already done. "Heard about the accident," Bywater said, his voice carrying cold amusement. "Wanted to make sure everything was all right." The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. Etta May stepped back from the sofa, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. The sheriff's knowing smile suggested he'd seen exactly what he'd come looking for. "I'm fine," Thomas said curtly. "Just some cuts and bruises. Looked like more than medical attention going on when I arrived." Bywater's gaze moved between them with predatory interest. "Mighty devoted wife you've got there, Hollister." Something in his tone set alarm bells ringing in Etta May's mind. This wasn't casual observation or small-town gossip. The sheriff was building towards something specific. "Is there official business here, Bywater? Or are you just making social calls now?" "Official business, actually." The sheriff pulled folded papers from his coat pocket. "Been doing some investigating into your marriage. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look." Thomas rose from the sofa despite his injuries, his body coiling with tension. "What kind of investigating?" "Marriage records, legal documents, family histories." Bywater's smile widened. "Turns out your wife here has some interesting connections she hasn't mentioned." Etta Mae's blood turned to ice water. Her past was supposed to be buried, forgotten, safely distant from this new life. Whatever Bywater had discovered could destroy everything they'd built. "Don't know what you're talking about," she managed. "Sure you don't." Bywater unfolded the papers with deliberate slowness. "See, I got curious about a woman who appeared from nowhere just when a rich rancher needed saving. So I started asking questions, following trails. Amazing what you can learn about a person's background when you put your mind to it." Thomas moved protectively closer to Etta Mae, his injured arm forgotten in the face of this new threat. "Get to the point, Sheriff. Point is, your marriage isn't what it appears to be. But then again, neither is your wife." Bywater spread the documents across the coffee table like playing cards. Birth records, legal papers, witness statements. Etta Mae's heart stopped as she recognized names and dates that connected her to a past she'd thought was safely buried. "Interesting thing about legal technicalities," Bywater continued conversationally. "Sometimes what starts as pretend becomes real, whether you planned it or not. Wyoming territory has some peculiar laws about marriage validity." The room spun around Etta Mae as the implications crashed over her. Their fake marriage ceremony, performed in front of witnesses, documented by the preacher, might actually be legally binding. The business arrangement they'd crafted so carefully could be real in the eyes of the law. "That's impossible," Thomas said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Check for yourself. According to territorial statute, witnessed ceremonies are valid regardless of the participants' original intentions." Bywater's pale eyes fixed on Etta Mae with disturbing intensity. "But there's something else you both should know. Something about family connections that changes everything." He pulled out a final document, this one bearing official seals and legal signatures. Etta Mae's breath caught as she saw her mother's name written in careful script, alongside another name that made her world tilt sideways. "Seems like fate has a sense of humor," Bywater said softly. "My mother was Sarah Washington, too. Different fathers, same mother. Makes us family, sister." The word hit Etta Mae like a physical blow. Half-brother. The sheriff who'd been investigating their marriage, questioning their motives, watching them with such particular interest, was her own blood relative. Thomas stared between them, comprehension dawning slowly. "You're related." "Been watching out for her from a distance for years," Bywater admitted. "Making sure she stayed safe, stayed out of trouble. When she got mixed up with you, I had to make sure your intentions were honorable." The room fell silent except for rain still battering the windows. Everything had changed in the space of a heartbeat. Their pretend marriage was real. The sheriff was her brother. The careful distance they'd maintained lay in ruins around their feet. Etta Mae sank into a chair, overwhelmed by revelations that rewrote everything she thought she knew about her life and future. The revelation hung in the parlor like smoke from a dying fire. Etta Mae stared at Sheriff Bywater, searching his weathered features for traces of the mother they'd shared. The pale eyes that had seemed so hostile now held something she recognized as protective concern. "You've been watching me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since you were 16. Made sure you had work when you needed it. Kept troublemakers away when they got ideas." Bywater folded the legal documents with careful hands. "When you got involved with Hollister, I had to know if he was using you or protecting you." Thomas remained standing despite his injuries, his body rigid with tension. The comfortable evening they'd shared lay shattered around them like broken glass. Everything had changed in the space of a few heartbeats. "So our marriage is legally binding," Thomas said, his lawyer's mind grappling with the implications. "According to territorial law, yes. Witnessed ceremony, official preacher, public declaration. Doesn't matter what your original intentions were." Bywater's expression softened as he looked at Etta Mae. "Question is, what do you both want to do about it?" The storm outside seemed to intensify, wind howling through the eaves like a living thing. Etta Mae rose from her chair and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. 6 months of careful pretense had led to this moment of impossible choice. The contract specified 1 year. she said without turning around. Contracts don't mean much when they're based on false premises, Thomas replied quietly. She faced him then, studying the man who had saved her from humiliation and given her family security beyond their wildest dreams. His dark eyes held something she'd been trying to ignore for weeks, something that violated every term of their business arrangement. What are you saying? Thomas crossed the room slowly, his injured arm held carefully against his body. When he stopped in front of her, she could see the rapid pulse at the base of his throat. I'm saying the contract was a lie from the beginning, not the legal part, the part about keeping our feelings out of it. The confession hit her like a physical blow. All those careful moments of distance, all the professional politeness, all the desperate attempts to ignore the growing connection between them. It had all been as much of a performance as their public marriage. Thomas. His name escaped as a plea or a prayer. I know what I promised. I know what we agreed to. But somewhere between protecting you from that judge and watching you care for my injuries tonight, everything changed. Bywater cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maybe I should leave you two to work this out privately. Stay, Etta May said quickly. You're family. You have a right to hear this. The word felt strange on her tongue. Family. She'd spent so many years believing she and her mother were completely alone in the world. Now she had a half-brother who'd been silently protecting her, and a husband who'd accidentally become real. What happens if we choose to make this genuine? She asked. Thomas reached up to cup her face with his uninjured hand. We face whatever comes together. The business challenges, the social pressure, the people who'll never accept us. All of it. And if we don't, we go back to pretending for 6 more months, then you disappear with your money, and I marry someone appropriate for a cattle baron. The alternatives laid out starkly between them, safety versus risk, security versus love, the practical choice her brain demanded versus the impossible hope her heart harbored. There's something else to consider, Bywater interjected. Cordelia Ashworth and her father haven't given up on breaking this marriage. They've been asking questions, offering rewards for information. If they find proof it started as a business arrangement, they'll use it to destroy you both. The external threat clarified everything for Etta May. Running away would leave Thomas vulnerable to his enemies and waste the sacrifice he'd made to protect her. Staying meant fighting for something real instead of hiding behind comfortable lies. Then we don't give them any proof to find, she said. Thomas's thumb brushed across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. Are you sure? Once we cross this line, there's no going back to the contract. No safe distance, no guaranteed escape route. She thought of her mother, healthy and content in the cottage Thomas provided, of the dress shop that had become more successful than she dared imagine, of the education she could finally use openly instead of hiding it like a shameful secret, of the man standing before her who'd risked everything to defend a stranger's dignity. I've been running from real feelings my entire life, she whispered. Maybe it's time to stop. Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of whiskey and rain and promises neither of them had planned to make. 6 months of careful restraint dissolved in the space of a heartbeat, replaced by something fierce and genuine and completely terrifying. Bywater made a disgusted sound and headed for the door. I'll leave you two to sort this out, but Etta May, if he hurts you, sheriff's badge won't protect him from me. The threat carried the weight of brotherly devotion discovered too late, but treasured nonetheless. Etta May smiled against Thomas's lips as the front door closed behind her newly discovered family. When they finally broke apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. No more contracts, no more conditions, no more pretending. No more pretending, she agreed. Outside, the storm began to ease as if nature itself approved of their decision. They had chosen love over safety, partnership over independence, truth over comfortable lies. The future stretched ahead uncertain but no longer lonely. 6 months later, they stood in the same parlor where their fake marriage had become real. Thomas held a match to their original contract, watching the pages curl and blacken in the fireplace. Etta May added her own document to the flames, a new agreement written in their own hands, promising to choose each other every day for the rest of their lives. The ashes rose up the chimney like prayers answered, carrying away the last traces of their careful deception and leaving only the magnificent truth of what they'd built together.